The flickering candlelight cast long shadows across the cramped study in Florence, where Niccolò Machiavelli hunched over his desk, quill in hand, wrestling with thoughts that would forever change how humanity understood power. The year was 1513, and the man who had once walked the corridors of power as a trusted diplomat now found himself exiled, his political career in ruins, his idealistic beliefs shattered by the harsh realities of Renaissance politics. Machiavelli had spent years believing that virtue, honor, and moral rectitude were the pathways to effective leadership. He had watched noblemen fall, witnessed virtuous princes lose their kingdoms, and observed how the most morally upright individuals often found themselves crushed beneath the wheels of political machinery operated by those who understood something fundamental about human nature that he was only beginning to grasp. The insight that would emerge from his solitary contemplation was revolutionary and disturbing in equal measure. Being nice, being moral, being virtuous in the traditional sense would not help a leader succeed. What mattered was power, understanding it, wielding it, and maintaining it through whatever means necessary. This realization would birth one of the most controversial and influential works in political philosophy, Il Principe, The Prince, and establish principles that continue to shape leadership and politics 5 centuries later. Part 1: The illusion of noble leadership in the grand palazzos of Renaissance Italy. Young Machiavelli had initially been seduced by the romance of noble leadership. The courts were filled with men who spoke eloquently of honor, who dressed in fine silks, who quoted classical philosophers and presented themselves as inheritors of Roman virtue. These were leaders who believed deeply in the power of moral example, in the notion that goodness would naturally inspire loyalty and that righteous behavior would inevitably lead to political success. Among these figures stood men like Piero Soderini, the Gonfalonier of Florence, who exemplified everything that traditional political wisdom suggested a leader should be. Soderini was incorruptible, principled, and genuinely concerned with the welfare of his people. He made decisions based on moral considerations rather than expedient ones. He treated his enemies with fairness and his allies with unwavering loyalty. He was, by every measure of traditional virtue, an exemplary leader. And, yet, as Machiavelli observed with growing unease, Soderini's very virtues became the instruments of his downfall. His unwillingness to use deception meant that his enemies could predict his moves. His commitment to fairness prevented him from taking the decisive actions necessary to eliminate threats to his rule. His moral qualms about using violence meant that he hesitated when bold action was required. When the political winds shifted and the Medici family orchestrated their return to power in Florence, Soderini's nobility provided no protection. His virtue did not inspire the fierce loyalty that might have saved him. Instead, his moral consistency made him appear weak to allies who needed strength and predictable to enemies who required an element of surprise to defeat. The fall of Soderini was not an isolated incident but part of a pattern that Machiavelli had witnessed throughout his diplomatic career. In France, he had observed King Louis XII, a monarch of considerable personal virtue who had nevertheless lost significant territories in Italy through his inability to understand the brutal realities of international politics. Louis had trusted allies who betrayed him, had shown mercy to enemies who used that mercy to regroup and strike again, and had allowed moral considerations to override strategic necessities until his position became untenable. Across the political landscape of Italy, similar stories played out with depressing regularity. The Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, had been a patron of the arts and a reasonably benevolent ruler, yet he lost his duchy to more ruthless competitors. The various republics and city-states that prided themselves on their democratic virtues and moral governance found themselves repeatedly outmaneuvered by leaders who were willing to employ methods that these virtuous rulers found abhorrent. Meanwhile, Machiavelli watched with fascination and horror as other types of leaders thrived in this environment. Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, was by any moral standard a monster. He was ruthless, deceptive, and capable of extraordinary cruelty. Yet Borgia had carved out a significant territory for himself in central Italy through a combination of strategic brilliance, tactical ruthlessness, and an intuitive understanding of power dynamics that enabled him to succeed where more virtuous men failed. Borgia's methods were instructive in their very amorality. When he conquered new territories, he did not rely on the gratitude of the conquered peoples or trust in their natural loyalty to sustain his rule. Instead, he systematically identified potential sources of resistance and eliminated them. He understood that mercy shown to enemies was often perceived as weakness, and that acts of cruelty, when properly calculated and executed, could establish a reputation that made future violence unnecessary. The young Machiavelli had initially recoiled from such methods, but his years of diplomatic service had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth: the leaders who survived and prospered were not those who adhered most closely to moral principles, but those who understood that political success required a different set of skills and a willingness to operate according to different rules than those that governed private moral behavior. This realization was profoundly disturbing to a man who had been raised in the humanist tradition, who believed in the essential dignity of human beings and the possibility of creating just and virtuous political institutions. Yet the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. In the arena of politics, traditional moral virtue was not merely insufficient, it was often counterproductive. The very qualities that made a person admirable in private life could become fatal weaknesses in the exercise of political power. The diplomatic missions that Machiavelli undertook on behalf of the Florentine Republic provided him with numerous opportunities to observe this principle in action. In his negotiations with various European powers, he encountered leaders who were personally charming, intellectually impressive, and morally upright, yet who consistently failed to advance their political interests because they were unwilling or unable to employ the necessary measures to secure their positions. Conversely, he met leaders whose personal character was questionable but whose political acumen was undeniable. These men understood that politics was essentially a game of power, and that power operated according to its own logic, which was often incompatible with conventional morality. They grasped that political relationships were fundamentally different from personal relationships, and that what worked in one sphere could be disastrous in the other. The revelation that began to crystallize in Machiavelli's mind was that there were, in effect, two different moral systems operating simultaneously in human society. There was the morality of private life, which emphasized virtues like honesty, compassion, fairness, and personal integrity. And there was the morality of political life, which prioritized effectiveness, stability, security, and the successful exercise of power in service of the state. These two moral systems were not merely different, they were often directly contradictory. The political leader who insisted on applying the moral standards of private life to political situations would find himself at a severe disadvantage when competing with leaders who understood that political success required a different approach. The virtuous prince who refused to lie would be outmaneuvered by those who understood that strategic deception was sometimes necessary. The moral ruler who showed consistent mercy would be seen as weak by those who recognized that occasional displays of force were essential to maintaining authority. This insight was revolutionary because it challenged one of the fundamental assumptions of classical political philosophy. From Plato and Aristotle through the medieval scholastics, political theorists had generally assumed that political virtue and personal virtue were essentially the same thing, that the qualities that made a person good would also make them an effective leader. Machiavelli was beginning to understand that this assumption was not merely wrong but dangerously misleading. The implications of this realization extended far beyond academic philosophy. If traditional moral virtue was indeed counterproductive in political contexts, then the entire educational and cultural system that prepared individuals for leadership roles was fundamentally flawed. The classical education that emphasized moral philosophy and ethical reasoning might actually be preparing future leaders for failure by instilling in them values and habits of thought that would handicap them in the exercise of political power. Moreover, if political success truly required methods that were incompatible with conventional morality, then society faced a profound dilemma. How could political institutions be designed to channel the ambitions of individuals who were, by the very nature of their success, likely to be morally questionable? How could the public good be served by leaders whose rise to power demonstrated their willingness to violate traditional moral standards? These questions would haunt Machiavelli throughout his period of exile and reflection, but they were questions that could not be answered by wishful thinking or moral idealism. The evidence of his experience was too overwhelming, the pattern too consistent. In the world of politics, power was the ultimate currency, and those who refused to acknowledge this fact did so at their peril. The old certainties about virtue and leadership had crumbled in the face of political reality. What remained was the need to construct a new understanding of political effectiveness based on clear-eyed observation of how power actually functioned rather than romantic notions of how it should function. This new understanding would be harsh and uncomfortable, but it would have the virtue of being true to the evidence of experience rather than the comfort of moral prejudice. Part 2, The Mechanics of True Power. As Machiavelli delved deeper into his analysis of political power, he began to identify the specific mechanisms through which effective leaders operated. The revelation that traditional virtue was counterproductive in political contexts was only the beginning. What was needed was a systematic understanding of the principles that actually govern successful political action. Through careful observation and analysis of both contemporary and historical examples, he began to discern patterns that revealed the true mechanics of power. The first principle that emerged from his analysis was the fundamental importance of understanding and managing perception. Political power, Machiavelli realized, was not primarily about objective reality but about how that reality was perceived by those whose support or opposition could determine a leader's fate. The most brilliant policies would fail if they were poorly presented, while mediocre initiatives could succeed if they were skillfully promoted and positioned. This insight illuminated why so many virtuous leaders had failed despite their good intentions and sound reasoning. They had focused on doing the right thing rather than on ensuring that their actions were perceived in the right way. They had assumed that good policies would speak for themselves, that virtuous intentions would be self-evident, and that rational arguments would naturally persuade rational people. In reality, public perception was shaped by emotion, prejudice, self-interest, and manipulation more than by objective analysis. The successful leader, therefore, needed to be a master of political theater. Every action had to be considered not only for its practical effects but for its symbolic impact. Every public appearance was an opportunity to reinforce desired perceptions and counter unfavorable narratives. The leader who neglected this dimension of political action, no matter how virtuous or competent, would find themselves at a severe disadvantage when competing with those who understood the importance of political dramaturgy. Cesare Borgia provided Machiavelli with numerous examples of this principle in action. When Borgia conquered the Romagna region, he faced the challenge of establishing his authority over a population that had no particular loyalty to him and every reason to resent his rule. Rather than relying on gradual reform or moral persuasion, Borgia orchestrated a series of dramatic gestures designed to establish his reputation for both power and justice. The most striking of these was his treatment of Ramiro di Orco, the cruel and efficient administrator whom Borgia had appointed to pacify the region. Di Orco had accomplished his mission through methods of extraordinary brutality, earning the hatred of the population but successfully eliminating resistance to Borgia's rule. Once the region was secure, Borgia faced a dilemma. He needed to distance himself from the cruelty that had been necessary for conquest while maintaining the reputation for strength that prevented future challenges. His solution was a masterpiece of political theater. One morning, the people of Cesena awoke to find Di Orco's body displayed in the public square, cut in half, with a wooden block and bloody knife beside it. The message was unmistakable. Borgia was strong enough to eliminate even his own most powerful lieutenants, yet just enough to punish those who had oppressed the people. In a single dramatic gesture, he had transformed himself from a conqueror to be feared into a ruler to be respected, while simultaneously eliminating a potential rival and distancing himself from the unpopular policies that had been necessary for his consolidation of power. The second principle that Machiavelli identified was the crucial importance of controlling the narrative. Political conflicts were not merely contests of strength or policy, they were battles over competing interpretations of events, competing claims about legitimacy, and competing visions of the future. The leader who could shape how events were understood and interpreted had a decisive advantage over those who focused only on the events themselves. This principle explained why so many militarily superior forces had been defeated by weaker opponents who were more skilled at propaganda and political communication. It illuminated why some leaders could survive scandals that would destroy others, and why certain policies could be implemented successfully in one context but fail catastrophically in another. The difference lay not in the objective merits of the policies or the personal character of the leaders, but in their relative ability to control the story that was told about their actions. The successful control of narrative required several distinct skills. First, the leader needed to understand the existing beliefs, prejudices, and emotional commitments of their audience. Arguments that contradicted deeply held beliefs would be rejected regardless of their logical merit, while those that reinforced existing prejudices would be accepted even if they were factually questionable. The effective leader therefore needed to frame their actions in terms that resonated with their audience's existing worldview rather than challenging them to adopt new perspectives. Second, the leader needed to anticipate and preemptively counter unfavorable interpretations of their actions. In the complex world of politics, almost any action could be interpreted in multiple ways, and opponents would naturally seize on the most damaging possible interpretation. The wise leader would therefore accompany their actions with explanations that established the preferred interpretation and made alternative interpretations seem unreasonable or malicious. Third, the leader needed to understand the importance of timing in narrative management. The same action could have completely different political effects depending on when and how it was revealed. Information released at the right moment could devastate an opponent, while identical information released poorly could backfire on its originator. The sophisticated political actor therefore needed to be a master of timing, understanding when to reveal information, when to hold it in reserve, and when to use it as a weapon. The third principle that emerged from Machiavelli's analysis was the fundamental importance of understanding and exploiting human psychology. Political action was ultimately about influencing human behavior, and such influence required a deep understanding of the psychological mechanisms that drove human decision-making. The leader who understood these mechanisms could achieve remarkable results with relatively modest resources, while those who ignored them would find that even overwhelming advantages could not guarantee success. Fear and love, Machiavelli observed, were the two primary emotions through which leaders could influence their followers, but they operated in fundamentally different ways and had very different strategic implications. Love was more pleasant for both ruler and subject, but it was also more fragile and less reliable. People's affections could change rapidly based on circumstances, personal interests, or the influence of competitors. Moreover, love was inherently reciprocal, it required ongoing investment and attention from the leader, and it could be withdrawn if that investment ceased or if the leader's actions disappointed expectations. Fear, by contrast, was more stable and reliable as a foundation for political power. People might stop loving a leader for any number of reasons, but they would continue to fear them as long as the leader maintained the credibility of their threats. Fear did not require the leader to be personally liked or admired, it only required them to be respected for their power and their willingness to use it. Moreover, fear could be established through relatively few dramatic demonstrations, whereas love required constant cultivation and reinforcement. The practical implications of this psychological insight were profound. The leader who relied primarily on being liked would find themselves constantly vulnerable to shifts in public opinion and competing appeals for the affections of their followers. They would need to spend enormous energy maintaining their popularity, and they would be severely constrained in their policy options by the need to avoid actions that might make them less popular. The leader who understood how to inspire appropriate fear, however, could operate with much greater freedom and security. They could implement necessary but unpopular policies without worrying about immediate political consequences. They could focus on long-term strategic objectives rather than short-term popularity. And they could maintain their position even when circumstances made it impossible to provide their followers with immediate benefits. The key qualification in Machiavelli's analysis was the word appropriate. The goal was not to be hated or to rule through terror, but to inspire a respectful fear that acknowledged the leader's power while recognizing their restraint in using it. The leader who was genuinely cruel would eventually provoke resistance and rebellion. The leader who was genuinely weak would invite challenges from competitors. But the leader who was known to be capable of decisive action when necessary, yet restrained enough to use such action judiciously, could achieve a stable foundation for power that did not depend on the fickleness of public affection. The fourth principle that Machiavelli identified was the critical importance of adaptability and flexibility in political strategy. The political environment was constantly changing, and strategies that were effective in one set of circumstances could become counterproductive when those circumstances shifted. The successful leader therefore needed to be able to adjust their approach based on changing conditions rather than adhering rigidly to predetermined plans or consistent moral principles. This principle directly contradicted one of the most cherished beliefs of traditional moral philosophy, the idea that consistency was a virtue and that moral principles should be applied uniformly regardless of circumstances. In the realm of politics, however, such consistency could be a fatal weakness. The leader who refused to adapt their approach when circumstances changed would find themselves employing ineffective methods long after those methods had ceased to work. The metaphor that Machiavelli used to illustrate this principle was that of a river in flood. Sometimes political circumstances resembled a calm, predictable stream that could be navigated through careful planning and steady effort. At other times, they resembled a raging flood that would sweep away anyone who tried to proceed according to normal methods. The wise leader needed to be able to recognize which type of situation they faced and adjust their approach accordingly. During periods of stability, the leader could afford to be more consultative, more gradual in implementing changes, and more attentive to the concerns of various constituencies. During periods of crisis, however, rapid decisive action might be essential, and the luxury of extensive consultation or gradual implementation might not be available. The leader who insisted on using the same methods in both situations would either be ineffectively slow during crises or unnecessarily authoritarian during stable periods. This need for adaptability extended beyond tactical considerations to fundamental questions of political strategy and even moral approach. Machiavelli's famous observation that a leader must know how to be both a fox and a lion captured this essential insight. There were situations where cunning and deception were more effective than force, and other situations where only overwhelming power could achieve the desired result. The successful leader needed to be capable of both approaches and wise enough to know which one was appropriate in any given circumstance. The implications of this principle were particularly challenging for leaders who had been educated in traditional moral philosophy, which emphasized the importance of consistent character and uniform application of moral principles. Such leaders would naturally resist the idea that they should alter their fundamental approach based on circumstances, viewing such flexibility as a form of moral compromise or personal weakness. Machiavelli's insight was that this resistance was itself a form of moral confusion. The higher moral obligation of the political leader was to serve the public good and maintain the stability and security of the state. If accomplishing these objectives required tactical flexibility and situational adaptation, then such flexibility was not a moral compromise but a moral necessity. The leader who sacrificed the welfare of the state in order to maintain personal moral consistency was placing their own psychological comfort above their political responsibilities. Part 3: The Dark Wisdom of Effective Leadership. The most profound and disturbing aspect of Machiavelli's insights concerned the fundamental nature of political leadership and the price that effective leaders must be willing to pay for their success. As his analysis deepened, he began to understand that political effectiveness required not merely different skills from those valued in private life, but a different relationship with morality itself. The truly effective political leader could not simply supplement traditional virtue with strategic thinking. They had to be prepared to abandon traditional moral constraints when those constraints conflicted with political necessity. This realization emerged from Machiavelli's careful study of historical examples, both ancient and contemporary. When he examined the careers of the most successful political leaders throughout history, he found a consistent pattern. At crucial moments in their careers, they had all been forced to choose between moral consistency and political effectiveness, and they had chosen effectiveness. Moreover, these choices had not been aberrations or failures of character, but essential elements of their success that had enabled them to achieve results that would have been impossible through purely virtuous means. The case of Ferdinand of Aragon provided Machiavelli with one of his most instructive examples. Ferdinand was personally devout, intellectually sophisticated, and genuinely committed to the welfare of his kingdoms. Yet his reign was marked by a series of actions that violated traditional moral principles. He broke treaties when it served his interests, used religious enthusiasm to justify territorial expansion, and employed deception and manipulation in his diplomatic relations. These actions were not evidence of personal corruption or moral failure, but calculated decisions that enabled him to unify Spain, establish it as a major European power, and provide his subjects with unprecedented security and prosperity. The key insight was that Ferdinand's moral transgressions were not incidental to his political success but essential to it. Had he rigidly adhered to conventional moral principles, he would have been unable to navigate the complex political challenges of his era. His treaties would have been honored by enemies who had no intention of honoring their own commitments. His diplomatic honesty would have been exploited by more sophisticated opponents. His religious scruples would have prevented him from taking actions necessary to secure his kingdoms against external threats. Yet Ferdinand's moral flexibility enabled him to achieve results that served a higher moral purpose. The Spain he created provided its citizens with greater security, prosperity, and opportunity than they had ever known. The political stability he established laid the foundation for cultural and economic achievements that would benefit countless future generations. His strategic deceptions and tactical cruelties had prevented larger conflicts and more widespread suffering. This pattern repeated itself throughout history. Augustus Caesar had achieved the Pax Romana through methods that included proscription lists, political assassination, and the systematic destruction of republican institutions. Yet the peace and prosperity that resulted from his rule had provided the foundation for centuries of relative stability and cultural achievement. The moral costs of his methods had been real and significant, but so had the moral benefits of the results he achieved. The same principle applied to more recent examples. Louis XI of France had been known as the Spider King for his use of deception, manipulation, and ruthless elimination of rivals. Yet his reign had unified France, established the foundations of royal power that would make France the dominant European power, and ended the chaotic violence that had characterized French politics for generations. His personal character was questionable by conventional moral standards, but the political results he achieved had served the interests of millions of his subjects. The disturbing implication of these examples was that political leadership might be inherently immoral by conventional standards. The skills and decisions that made leaders effective in serving the public good might be precisely those that violated traditional moral principles. If this was true, then society faced a fundamental dilemma: it needed leaders who were willing to act immorally in order to achieve moral results. This dilemma was further complicated by the recognition that political leadership could not be understood simply as a technical skill that could be separated from moral character. The willingness to violate conventional moral constraints was not merely a tool that leaders could choose to employ when necessary, it was a fundamental aspect of their psychology that shaped how they approached all political problems. The leader who was capable of strategic deception and calculated cruelty possessed a different type of mind than the leader who was constitutionally incapable of such actions. Machiavelli's analysis suggested that effective political leaders shared certain psychological characteristics that distinguished them from both ordinary citizens and conventional moral exemplars. They possessed an unusual ability to compartmentalize their thinking, separating their evaluation of political necessities from their personal moral preferences. They were capable of making decisions based on long-term strategic calculations rather than immediate emotional responses. And they had developed what might be called moral flexibility, the ability to adjust their ethical framework based on the requirements of their situation. Most importantly, they possessed what Machiavelli termed virtù, a concept that was related to but distinct from traditional virtue. Virtù encompassed the psychological strength necessary to make difficult decisions, the intellectual clarity to see situations as they really were rather than as one wished them to be, and the emotional resilience to bear responsibility for actions that might be personally distasteful but politically necessary. The development of virtù required a fundamental reorientation of moral thinking. Instead of asking whether an action was inherently right or wrong according to abstract moral principles, the leader with virtù asked whether the action would serve the ultimate purpose of political leadership, the security, stability, and prosperity of the state and its citizens. This was not moral relativism or nihilism, but a different type of moral framework that prioritized consequences over intentions and collective welfare over individual moral purity. The practical implications of this reorientation were profound and often counterintuitive. The leader with virtù might need to punish loyal supporters in order to maintain credibility with opponents. They might need to break promises in order to prevent larger betrayals. They might need to use violence to prevent greater violence, or employ deception to achieve greater honesty in political relationships. Perhaps most challenging of all, they might need to accept personal moral compromise in order to serve higher moral purposes. The leader who insisted on maintaining personal moral purity would often find themselves unable to achieve results that could benefit countless other people. The choice was not between moral and immoral action, but between different types of moral frameworks with different types of costs and benefits. This insight illuminated why so many traditional moral exemplars had been ineffective political leaders, and why many effective political leaders had been questionable moral exemplars. The skills and psychological characteristics required for political effectiveness were simply different from those required for conventional moral virtue. Society needed both types of individuals, but it needed to understand that they served different functions and operated according to different principles. The recognition of this difference had implications that extended far beyond individual leadership styles. If political effectiveness truly required moral flexibility, then political institutions needed to be designed with this reality in mind. Rather than assuming that political leaders would be moral exemplars, institutions needed to channel the ambitions and capabilities of individuals whose moral compass was oriented toward political results rather than conventional virtue. This meant creating systems of accountability that focused on political outcomes rather than personal moral character. It meant developing checks and balances that assumed leaders would sometimes act in morally questionable ways and attempted to ensure that such actions served the public interest rather than private ambition. And it meant educating citizens to evaluate their leaders based on political effectiveness rather than personal likability or conventional moral virtue. The ultimate insight that emerged from Machiavelli's analysis was perhaps the most disturbing of all. The qualities that made someone an admirable human being in private life were often precisely those that would make them a liability in political leadership. Conversely, the qualities that made someone an effective political leader were often those that would make them problematic in personal relationships. This created a tragic dimension to political leadership that conventional political philosophy had largely ignored. The individual who sought to serve the public good through political leadership would almost inevitably find themselves forced to compromise their personal moral integrity. They would be required to develop capabilities and make decisions that would distance them from conventional moral community. The very success that enabled them to serve others would exact a personal cost that might be invisible to those they served but would be very real to themselves. Yet Machiavelli's analysis suggested that this tragedy was not a failure of political systems or individual character, but an inherent aspect of the human condition. Political life and private life operated according to different moral logics, and the attempt to apply the moral standards of one sphere to the other would inevitably result in failure and frustration. The wise society would recognize these differences and create institutions that could benefit from the capabilities of both types of individuals without expecting either to conform to inappropriate moral standards. The secret insight that Machiavelli had discovered was ultimately about the nature of reality itself. Political power was not a tool that could be wielded according to conventional moral principles, it was a fundamental force in human affairs that operated according to its own logic. The leader who understood and accepted this logic could achieve remarkable results in service of the public good. The leader who refused to accept it would find themselves ineffective regardless of their good intentions or personal virtue. This was not a counsel of despair or an argument for moral nihilism. It was a recognition that effective moral action in the political sphere required a sophisticated understanding of how power actually functioned rather than romantic notions of how it should function. The leader who truly wished to serve others needed to be willing to master the tools that could make such service effective, even if those tools were incompatible with conventional moral sensibilities. Being nice, in other words, would not help because niceness was a luxury that political leaders could not afford without betraying their responsibilities to those they served. Power did help because power was the currency through which political leaders could translate their intentions into reality. The leader who understood this distinction and was willing to act on it could accomplish things that would be impossible for those who insisted on maintaining conventional moral purity at the expense of political effectiveness. The document that Machiavelli would eventually produce from these insights would scandalize generations of readers who preferred to believe that political leadership could be both effective and conventionally virtuous. Yet his analysis would prove remarkably durable because it was based on clear-eyed observation of political reality rather than wishful thinking about what that reality should be. The secret he had discovered, that power operates according to its own moral logic, remains as relevant today as it was 5 centuries ago, continuing to challenge and disturb those who encounter it for the first time while providing practical wisdom for those who are willing to accept its uncomfortable truths.